Welcome to Sound of Resistance channel. The ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia enraged Ukrainian allies. Ukraine's allies, despite all the sanction decisions taken on behalf of Russia, caused anger when the Russian army continued its occupation in Ukraine and carried out attacks against international law and human rights. Russia carried out multiple missile attacks on Ukraine city centers last month. The missile attack carried out by Russian army targeted civilian settlements. Many civilians were killed and many residents were injured in the Russian missile attacks. The Russian military also targeted the country's power plant and infrastructure facilities to make life difficult for civilians living in Ukraine. With the attack targeting Ukraine city centers, Russia aimed to break the resistance of the Ukrainians living in the region. Many countries reacted to Russia after the illegal attack by the Russian army on Ukraine's city centers. Ukraine's allies called out to Russian leader Putin, saying that they should stop the missile attacks, to endanger the lives of civilians in Ukraine as soon as possible. Otherwise, they will add a new one to the existing sanctions. President of Ukraine Zelensky, Russia showed its true face as always, especially after the attack of the Russian army on Kiev. He said that the Russian army is trying to achieve the success it could not achieve in Ukraine by scaring the Ukrainian people. The attack on the Ukrainian city centers did not actually happen exactly as Russian leader Putin wanted. The missile attack, which Putin launched to break the resistance of the Ukrainian people, made the Ukrainians more closer to each other. As the Russian missiles passed over them, the people of Ukraine joined together and sang their national anthem. The heroic resistance of the Ukrainian people against Putin's missiles was appreciated by the whole world. Ukraine's allies stated that the Russian army must put an end to its attacks against international law. One of the first countries to make a sound on the subject was England. While the UK promises to destroy Vladimir Putin, it wants to brand Russia as a terrorist state for its unlawful attacks on Ukraine. The British Foreign Secretary, Mr. Cleverly, said the UK would always try to hinder Russia's ability to fight in Ukraine. British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly has hinted that Britain is willing to brand Russia as a terrorist state while the Kremlin's illegal war in Ukraine continues. When asked by Labour MP Liam Bryan on the Selected Committee on Foreign Affairs whether the UK Foreign Office had identified Russia as terrorist state, Mr. Cleverly refused to ignore it. He said there are reasons to look for to do so. The British Foreign Secretary said he doesn't want to speculate publicly about future appointments, while the UK will always make sure we block Russia's ability to fight in Ukraine. Mr. Bryan, British Foreign Secretary James Cleverly asked a question. Mr. Bryan said, "You said earlier that Putin's hostility should not go unpunished. Isn't it time we thought about banning the United Russia Party, just as we banned political organizations like Hamas?" she asked. Asked by Mr. Bryan, Mr. Cleverly replied, "I think there are reasons to look at the broader bans. You will know that we are not publicly speculating about future bans and appointments," said. After his reply to Mr. Cleverly, he was asked if this was possible, not impossible. "No," said Mr. Cleverly. Mr. Bryan continued to question the British Foreign Secretary. Mr. Bryan later said, "How would you like to designate Russia as a state that supports terrorism?" she asked. The foreign minister replied, "Likewise, I will not speculate about future appointments, but what we will always do is make sure we hinder Russia's ability to fight in Ukraine. As the UK, we do this with our sanctions efforts against Russia. We have done this by continuing to ensure that Ukrainians can defend themselves. We will also continue to ensure that the Russian military in Ukraine has a framework to bring perpetrators of war crimes and human rights abuses to justice," Cleverly added. An example of Mr. Cleverly's war crimes and human rights violations by the Russian military came from the President of Ukraine, Zelensky. Investigators uncovered more than 400 Russian war crimes in the New Kherson, which was retaken by Ukrainian forces last week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said over the weekend. In his evening speech, Mr. Zelensky said investigators had found the bodies of both soldiers and civilians. He told the Ukrainian people investigators have already documented more than 400 Russian war crimes. The bodies of dead civilians and soldiers have been found. Mr. Cleverly's comments came as Britain announced today that it is withdrawing peacekeepers from Mali, saying the West African nations growing the reliance on Russian mercenaries in the Wagner Group is undermining stability. When Liberal Democrat MP Richard Ford was asked if he would raise the issue of banning the Wagner Group as a terrorist organization with the Home Secretary, Armed Forces Secretary James Heappey replied, "I certainly will." British Armed Forces Minister James Heappey said the 300-strong British force deployed in Mali since 2020 as part of the United Nations peacekeeping mission will leave sooner than planned. However, tensions escalated between Mali, its African neighbor, and the West after the Mali government allowed Russian mercenaries from the Wagner Group to be deployed on its territory. Mr. Heappey described Wagner's forces as group of murderers, thugs violating human rights. The Wagner Group is linked to mass human rights abuses, and the Mali government's partnership with the Wagner Group is counterproductive to lasting stability and security in their region, said James Heappey, British Minister of Armed Forces. While Britain is trying to take strict measures against Russia, the Ukrainian army is trying to root out the Russian army from the inside. The attacks of the Ukrainian army also caused panic in the neighboring countries. The intensification of the war in Ukraine poses the biggest threat to Ukrainian fighters, Lukashenko, Belarus officials said. Vladimir Putin's close ally Alexander Lukashenko fears war-hardened Belarusian volunteers will return from Ukraine and overthrow the Putin regime, a defense expert said. Belarusian opposition fighters actively support the Ukrainian army. Dr. Jacek Robo, Poland's leading defense and security expert, suggested that Belarusian volunteers in Ukraine may begin to use unconventional tactics currently used against Russian forces to wage a guerrilla campaign against the Belarusian regime. Polish defense and security expert Dr. Jacek Robo said there are many volunteers within the Ukrainian forces who serve not only for Ukraine but also for an independent Belarus. Because from the first day of the war, Ukrainian soldiers use not only the conventional approach but also unconventional warfare to defend against Russian forces, he said. In addition to Dr. Jacek Robo's explanation, Belarusian volunteers will take on some tasks in their region, and I think this is the biggest threat to Lukashenko. Dr. Jacek Rubo, hundreds of Belarusians have reportedly joined the Ukrainian armed forces since the beginning of the war. And Belarusian volunteers formed their own separate battalions, which later saw action in the defense of Kiev. Putin is known to have pressured Lukashenko to fully participate in the Russian operation in Ukraine. But Dr. Robo argued that the Belarusian dictator was unwilling to risk his own power in such a high-risk military venture. The analyst believes that if Lukashenko decides to support Russian forces, the ability of the Belarusian regime to contain internal opposition will be harmed. The war in Ukraine has literally turned into chess. The parties make their moves and shape their next moves according to the developments. If you look at the latest developments in Ukraine, the Ukrainian army has now cornered the Russian army and is preventing the Russian army from making a new move. Thank you for watching us.